Hello everybody watching. This is my first ever attempt at creating an analysis of a game design in video form. Usually opt for a document of sorts, but considering videos are much more accessible, I really wanted to talk about this. In this video I want to highlight a recently unveiled combat system, the one I've seen in Hogwarts Legacy. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of the game and probably not for having such miraculous gameplay. And that's probably justified, as the game does a very poor job at highlighting how remarkable the combat system actually is, by constantly undermining it through tangential features that trivialize it. Before I can go into explaining why I like the combat system so much, I first need to elaborate a little bit on the way I look at games in general. To this end I have created a small pseudo-mathematical illustration. So meet the complexity plane. No, not the complex plane, the complexity plane. The variables on the right all have a strong relation to the concept, and I will explain them as we go. First we need to define some axioms. Let us assume the x-axis represents the mechanical complexity of the game. Even though this might not always be easily quantifiable, think of it as the amount of rules imposed on the player. For the second axiom, we define the area created by the rectangle starting from the origin to any point in this plane as the overall complexity of the game. Think of this as the amount of dynamic situations that can be created from the rule set. Since we have established that the surface area equates to the overall complexity of the game, and the x-axis depicts the mechanical complexity, the y-axis must represent the overall complexity divided by the mechanical complexity. We will refer to this concept as elegance. Elegance is pretty easily understood intuitively as the amount of dynamic situations that we can create from the average rule. To further this intuition, here are some examples of easily recognizable games. Note that any of the concrete numbers on either axis are nonsensical, let alone the surface area. They are merely there to give you a vague idea of the concept that we are talking about and the relationship they form to one another. Chess, for example, is a game with a fairly straightforward rule set that can be taught to pretty much anyone in the span of an hour. Most people recognize that chess is a game which is difficult to master due to the large amounts of variations that can occur during the play. Chess is a good example of a game that has a high elegance. Go is another game with simple rules. It is even very simple in comparison to chess. Even though Go isn't quite as complex as chess is, the elegance is much higher. It creates a truly remarkable amount of dynamic situations from what appears to be just a handful of rules. Note that both chess and Go, which are easily recognized as elegant games, assume a rather vertically oriented form in display. As for a game that has a truly daunting complexity, we can look at Dota. It has a very fast rule set and a lot of mechanics to learn. It is almost impossible for a person to learn the intricacies of the game even after multiple weeks, maybe even months of playing the game. Dota is also at least a decently elegant game, creating a wealth of dynamic situations. In fact, Dota's complexity is so immense that I can confidently state that it is far beyond what the human brain can optimize. It is also worth asking the question whether a game of such complexity is even worth pursuing. Lastly, as an example of a more horizontally oriented design, we also have the genre of roguelites, or roguelite games. Roguelites are known for introducing a wealth of mechanics and combinations, but are also known for not creating a whole lot of dynamic situations from them. Instead, this genre prefers to allow users to explore new mechanics and find occasional interactions between them, making the player virtually unstoppable. Now that we have some understanding of what the first three terms mean, we can move on to the discussion of accessibility. I think almost everybody watching has some intuition of what accessibility means, but let's just define it as follows for clarity's sake. Accessibility is defined by the player's ability to understand the rules in any situation posed by the game. Even though isolating accessibility is very hard, as it has many different phases, we can confidently state that adding more rules decreases it. It takes much longer for the player to become acclimated to what the game wants him to do, after all. As such, we can state that accessibility scales inversely with mechanical complexity. Now I would like to move on to some observations. A rather straightforward observation is that in almost any game the complexity far exceeds the mechanical complexity. Take for example moving a character on a rectangular grid. The rule states that they are allowed to move over the grid, and consequently the player can move in any direction. Let's look at a simple example of a game that has exactly 4 rules and creates a total of 24 dynamic situations from them. The game's elegance must consequently be equal to 6. Remember that all these numbers are nonsensical and don't really mean anything at all. They are just to illustrate the concept. Now the game designer notices that there are 2 situations they consider undesirable. In reacting to this, they create 2 new rules specifically designed to prevent these from occurring and altering the situation. The complexity of the game does not grow, but the elegance receives a substantial hit, being reduced from 6 to 4, a 33% drop. The accessibility of the game also decreases while offering no new situations for the player to master. So to close out this section of the preliminaries, some general takeaway. A high degree of elegance implies that the game has a relatively high skill ceiling. In other words, the player can spend a long time trying to master what the rules actually mean to them as a player. A game with a high degree of mechanical complexity implies that the player spends a long amount of time trying to understand how things even work. The game categorizes this as exploration, and that it's a primary means it's being leveraged in games that opt for a high degree of this. Lastly, and probably most controversially, in my opinion in all of this. To me, a game that isn't deliberately trying to be gimmicky, like a horror game or a roguelike, should probably be focusing on achieving a high degree of elegance. This might be in the form of a very simple game that makes exceptional use of its rules, like Go or chess, or something that is simply well communicated, while allowing for a high skill ceiling in the process. The last thing I feel like I should be mentioning is that the complexity plane of course does not encapsulate all that is required to make a good game. The game must also be fun and must feel good to play. There are many things that can be studied and considered and must be considered before the package is complete, such as graphics, sound design, the pace of the game and more. Designing games, after all, is a pretty complicated topic. Now that everyone roughly understands my perspective, I would like to move on to actually examining Hogwarts Legacy's combat system. And to do so we unfortunately first need to strip away a lot of what the game offers by ourselves, as the game makes a surprising effort to bury it underneath mechanics that simply trivialize it. From here on out I will only consider the following mechanics to be part of the combat system. Protego, which acts like a parry, and its perfect equivalent. Stupefy, which acts like a follow-up to a parry and manifests itself as a projectile that stuns. The roll, which is identically used in similar games. The basic attack chain, which consists of a pattern of 3 minor hits and 1 big finale, before briefly locking the player into an animation. Ancient Magic, a slowly charging attack that does tremendous damage, and its complementary orbs, which fill the meter. Any of the spells that the player can obtain in any of their spell slots except the cursed spells. Note that this excludes talents, any potions or plants, including the healing potion, simply for the aforementioned either fully or partially trivialize the fundamental mechanics of the combat system. One of the first things I noticed about Hogwarts Legacy's combat system is how it incorporates a parry system that we find in the Batman Arkham series. This parry mechanic offers the players a small notification when a strike is about to hit them, and if acted upon swiftly, an immediate opportunity to punish the assailant. The system is particularly welcome in situations where the player finds himself completely overwhelmed by enemies, as the attack may occur from outside of the player's view. Hogwarts Legacy creates a spin on the system by introducing 2 variations. One where the player is allowed to parry, including a perfect parry when timed properly, and one where the player can only roll out of the way. Both are communicated distinctly differently, primarily through the use of transparent color coding. The parry notification consists of 2 rings which converge over time. Upon perfectly overlapping, the player gets hit by the projectile, while parrying right when the 2 collide yields a perfect parry, reflecting the damage back to the attacker and breaking their shield. The visualization is so transparent that it even accounts for the distance the projectile has to travel before reaching the player, simply by having the circles converge according to the time it would take for said projectile to reach the player. Outside of splitting the mechanic in 2 variations, Hogwarts Legacy's parry does not move the player to the location the incoming strike originated from, as it does in the Batman Arkham series. making the effects slightly more generic in nature. Enemy attacks generally abide by 3 rules. They are either a parryable attack, a non-parryable attack, or some channeled effect that is usually much more poorly communicated. The aftermath of the impact varies too, ranging from stun effects to damage as long as the parry remains within the attack's area. I'm definitely not a big fan of the way some of these are implemented, but I will recognize that they allow for some new dynamic situations. Other than attacks, enemies can also defend themselves through another well-communicated rather generic mechanic, shields. Shields are color-coded according to the class of spells that would destroy them. They can also be destroyed through the use of ancient magic, a perfect parry, or objects found or created in the direct environment. Note that any of the mechanics outside the newly introduced color coding for shields are things that the player is already familiar with. The reuse of rules in another context allows for a generic design that the player can understand even if the situation itself is new to them. The color coding is later also applied almost identically to enemy attacks, further reducing the mechanical rules back to just a handful. The game categorizes spells according to their class, denoted by a distinct color. There are a total of 3 colors, yellow, red and purple. Red spells primarily deal damage, with the notable exception of Expelliarmus, which disarms the target instead. Yellow has 2 spells that serve as a good way to initiate a fight, 1 spell that transforms the unit into an environmental weapon on a very long cooldown, and 1 spell that can either be used to initiate a fight or as a combo piece, enhancing the damage of a follow-up attack. Purple has 2 spells that are most easily used to initiate a fight, one that is a situational damage spell and the Pulso, which pushes the target away. As you might have noticed from me merely summing up the spell's common use cases, there's a lot of overlap within the same class, and unfortunately these tend to not combine well either. On the flip side, most of the spells are intuitively understood and quite a few of them are generic in nature. The system might be up for some reordering and reorganizing, but to its credit, it's very transparent and easy to grasp, while allowing for a surprising amount of dynamic situations. It merely needs some restructuring. To look at an example of a spell that I perceived as very well designed, we can look at the Pulso. It's a very simple spell that, due to its generic nature, finds use in a wide array of different situations. Consequently, the spell can be applied to break purple shields, topple over enemies for a comparatively weak stun effect, throwing enemies into one another or terrain, or best of all, offer ledge for an instant kill effect. It also has uses outside of combat by being able to push objects. The Pulso is a spell that fits a lot of dynamic situations despite being very easy to understand, and should, in my opinion, be the kind of spell you want to strive for. Now I want to move on to what I would assume would probably be the most controversial part of this whole video. Since a lot of situations posed by either game are strikingly similar, and especially because both games follow distinctly different philosophies, I would like to compare this combat system to the one we see in the Soulsborne games. The Soulsborne games sport a combat model that had many years to mature, and it shows. The overall complexity of the newer installment absolutely blows Hogwarts Legacy out of the water. However, I would argue that the games do not reach the complexity through particularly elegant means. A lot of the enemies in these games are designed to be an intimidating presence. Bosses especially are introduced with a severe sense of dread. The player feels like they aren't going to be able to overcome these overwhelming odds. To enhance this feeling, a lot of the bosses have strikingly unique attack patterns, causing even the most seasoned players to play cautiously. The bosses must first be observed and understood. Some bosses take this to almost caricatural levels, like Melinia's Waterfall Dance, requiring a role pattern so specific it left a lot of players puzzled and annoyed. But even beneath the surface the attacks remain vague, leading to internal questions like: how much poise damage do I receive for blocking this attack? What follow-up am I to expect? Can I parry this attack? What exactly is the attack's hitbox and can I strafe away from it? And many more. This increases the complexity of the game, but also decreases the elegance in the process. After all, many of the new attacks cannot readily be reduced to a situation the players are already familiar with. They must first experiment before they can act optimally. I would argue a lot of these attacks are mechanics in their own right. This results in the Soulsborne games being particularly inaccessible, while not offering a lot of more dynamic situations in exchange. After all, mastering one boss will definitely help you in future encounters. You will still have to learn the mechanics of them first. And to be a little defensive here, I can understand the appeal of having to solve a mostly new puzzle at every encounter, but it is not what I would strive for in the game. Hogwarts Legacy's combat system is far too lenient, and essentially still an infant, but it promises a solution that is both accessible and allows for a very high skill ceiling. The closest comparison I could think of is the game Doom Eternal, which is unsurprisingly one of my favorite games. It can be played by both casual players as well as those willing to commit more time, and seeing both categories play the game almost feels like watching two completely different games. In other words, accessible but with a high skill ceiling. Thank you for watching the video.